Well, Prime Minister Trudeau is set to meet with U.S. President Joe Biden in Mexico City this morning. Trudeau and his wife arrived in Mexico yesterday ahead of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Summit, a.k.a. the Three Amigos. And joining us live on CB24 Breakfast now is Frank McKenna, current Deputy Chairman of TD Bank, former Canadian Ambassador to the U.S., and, of course, also former Premier to New Brunswick. Mr. McKenna, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate this. Let's talk about the trilateral summit, Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. There is a sense among some that Canada could be sort of relegated to almost not third party status, but sort of third priority status at this summit here. How do you feel about Canada going into the summit and the stakes here?
Well, I don't think there'll be any doubt that we'll be an equal participant. We do have the largest economic relationship with the United States, and that matters a lot. But having said that, I recall getting into a bit of a tiff with Condoleezza Rice when she was Secretary of State. And I said, look, why don't you pay more attention to Canada? And she said, look, we save our attention for people who are giving us trouble. She said, Canada's like a condominium association. She said, a little paint job here, a little bit of a plumbing job there, and everything's okay. So if we don't get quite as much attention on immigration issues, violence, fentanyl, and so on, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
That's a really interesting perspective, Mr. McKenna, and I do appreciate bringing that up because it is one of those things. Sometimes we feel like we're not getting enough attention, but perhaps it's sort of the squeaky wheel gets the oil and we're kind of, running fairly well here. But there have been issues with the Canada-U.S. relationship in particular, certainly under the Trump administration. And even now, the Biden administration has held on to some of the situations specifically around the auto industry and, what's, American-made versus what's Canadian-made here. How do you feel about that part of the sort of equation here that, the Americans have been willing to sort of fight over this while Canada and Mexico have sort of been, trying to get in, as it were?
Yeah, so they're always going to be at one of these summits. There'll be pure trilateral issues, and then pure bilateral issues. An example of a bilateral issue is Haiti. United States is talking directly to Canada on Haiti. And a trilateral issue would be the entire EV supply train, and Canada, Mexico, and the United States all have a common cause in trying to create a North American powerhouse in terms of EV vehicles and also in terms of batteries and the production of batteries. So we'll be working together very closely on some of those issues. Mexico clearly has a strong interest in being a nearshoring hub, and Canada, that would be the case too, although we wouldn't have the advantage of lower wages, but we bring other considerable attributes to the party. And in the case of critical minerals, we have a unique advantage over other countries in the world.
That's interesting, too. Now, what is at stake here, then, for the Canadian economy when it comes to sort of, trade relationships? Of course, this is the North-South trading relationship, but we've seen the Trudeau government, work a lot on Pan-Pacific trade, also working on EU trade, and then, of course, trade with Britain after Brexit. So where does the sort of North-South, North American trade fit into Canada's greater trade picture?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. We should continue pursuing free trade agreements with Europe and trans-Pacific partnerships and other entities around the world. I think it's the nature of Canada. It's in our DNA. But we need to tend to the garden close to home as well. And the biggest trading relationship we have, is, of course, is with the United States, and another significant one is with Mexico. So we need to do a lot of work to tend that garden, because that's the low-hanging fruit in the relationship. And that's where the irritants tend to come, because that's where most of the commerce takes place. So when you've got $1 trillion of economic activity, inevitably there'll be some irritants and things that we need to fix. Mm-hmm.
And we do know also that Trudeau has been pushing for a bilateral meeting, just kind of one-on-one, effectively with Joe Biden. How important is it that happens?
Well, it is important. In fact, I think it may have already happened, but on the margins of these summits, there are almost always bilateral meetings, and the smaller the summit, the easier it is. If you end up having 20, such as the G20, it's very difficult. I want to take advantage of your show, though, to highlight a small little area that doesn't get discussed, that has the potential for a considerable cooperation between Mexico and Canada. Gun violence is a massive issue. It's a massive issue in Canada, with the number of guns from the United States coming in here and being used in the commission of crimes as much as 70 or 80%. In Mexico, it's even more graphic. They only have one registered gun shop in Mexico, and the Department of National Defense governs it. And yet they had 130,000 people killed in the last 6 years with gun violence. 500,000 guns, all American, coming in and killing people. So we both have the same problem. And they've started litigating against gun manufacturers, against the various second and third parties involved in the gun trade, trying to get around the litigation bar which exists in the United States. And I've always felt that we should join in that as well. Look, we're undergoing a gun control debate in Canada, and there are some for it and some against it, but almost all make the point that we need to at least, at a minimum, stop the guns coming in from the United States. So anything that we can do to join other parties in trying to reduce the flow of metal coming in from the United States, I think is going to be seen well politically as well as practically.
Yeah, that is certainly a supply chain that we would like to see cut off when it comes to North-South trade. Frank McKenna, Deputy Chairman at TD Bank and former Canadian Ambassador to the U.S. and Premier, of course, of New Brunswick. Appreciate the time this morning. Thanks so much for joining us.